Welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Spires. I am the grants manager at One Ohio. It's great to see so many people joining on our call today, and I'm very excited to share with you our Impact Academy on grant writing. So I'll quickly go over our agenda for today's meeting. I'm going to start by giving an overview of our 2024 regional grant cycle. We know that many on the call may have participated as an applicant in that cycle and are probably looking for some more information on it. And I will be discussing the themes that we saw in successful applications. We'll then be moving into best practices for grant writing and offering up some suggestions for additional funding opportunities that are outside of One Ohio. And at the end, we will have time for questions and answers. You won't be able to unmute yourself during today's session, but there is a Q&A feature. So if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A and our staff will be monitoring that. And at the end, we'll have time to address your questions. So our first ever regional grant cycle for One Ohio involved a 6-step process. It began with our registration and compliance phase, in which staff ensured that everyone was eligible to apply. In step 2, you submitted your full application. In step 3, that went to our regional review committee. We had 19 committees throughout the state that reviewed all of the applications that came to their region and then made their funding recommendations, which went to the expert panel. Our expert panel was really looking at the evidence base component of your application, and they were ensuring that the applications were consistent with the Ohio abatement strategies. So after the expert panel conducted their technical review, it went on to our grants committee in step 5, who did their own review and then made final funding recommendations to our full board at step 6, who then gave their approval. In this 6-step process, we had a network of 377 people. And I share these numbers here just to show the amount of collaboration that went into these funding decisions. We had input at the local level, at our expert level, and our state level. A lot of people had a place to collaborate in these funding decisions. We received a staggering 1,442 grant applications from 777 organizations. This was far beyond our expectations for the cycle. It was very exciting to see the number of organizations that have ideas for how to improve this sector. And I want to draw everyone's attention to the total amount requested, which was over $500 million. We had just over 51 million to award this cycle, and we just want to show that we only had a small fraction of the funding available for the requests that we received. So we know that there were good projects that did not, maybe well-written applications, good ideas, and they were not funded simply because we didn't have enough funding available this year. It was not necessarily an indication of the quality of the work. And there's some additional information about project length and what types of organizations were applying for our funding, just to give you an idea of what we at the foundation received. I'm going to quickly review just a few of the categories that may have influenced your funding determination. The application needed to fit our approved purposes, which I won't read them to you, but this was our target of what we were hoping to do with this grant funding as it was described in our request for proposals. And we had a list of unallowable expenses. If your project included one of these components, that may have led to its funding determination. Our 19 regions had the opportunity to put forward priority areas for their funding. This chart is just an example of some of them. As you can see with Region 1, not every region had a funding priority. Some were open to all ideas. However, some had selected specific priorities, and if your application did not fall under that priority, it may have not been selected for funding. This map shows where our 19 regions fall in the state. Some of our larger metropolitan areas are a one county region, and then we have other regions which are made up of multiple counties. And if you're interested in learning more about the regions, I'd recommend you go to our website where you can see more details about our regional makeup. The foundation had a robust process for avoiding conflicts of interest. Everyone who was involved in our process, from our staff to our board to our regional volunteers, they all submitted a related party questionnaire which disclosed any conflicts that they may have had. We provided training to our grant reviewers on avoiding conflicts, as well as offered a quick guide and some instructions on how they could conduct their conversations while avoiding those. If a conflict arose, the individual disclosed that and then recused themselves from the conversation. One component of our application that may have been new to many of you was that we required your project have an evidence base. And perhaps this was your first time needing to write about an evidence base. So we did provide some materials. We had this quick guide as well as an Impact Academy on the evidence base requirement. If you haven't written on this before, I would highly recommend you look at some of these resources, as they could help improve your application, not only for us, but for other funders as well. I'm going to review what we saw in our successful applications. What were the common themes for those that were selected for funding? So, successful applications met the RFP criteria. Now, this one might seem obvious, but we did have many applications that perhaps it's a good project, but it did not fit what we were asking for in our request for proposals. So my advice there is to really make sure you're carefully reading the RFP to see if your project is a good fit before you fill out the application. Successful applications fit the region's funding priorities, as we discussed. And successful applications targeted the appropriate audience. We did see a number of applications that maybe they were helping the population of Ohio generally, but they weren't targeting that focus group that we were looking for, which was individuals with substance use disorder. Successful applications clearly described what they were going to do. This is another one that might feel obvious. However, we did hear from numerous grant reviewers that they would read a whole application and still not understand what the project was. So my advice on this one is, maybe you have a colleague that doesn't know anything about the grant project. Maybe you have a friend that works in a different sector. If they're willing to read your application, and then ask them if they understand what the project is. We saw applications that generally described their organization, but didn't hone in on what's that project that the grants funds would be used for. And going along with clearly describing the project is providing a detailed budget. If the budget's too general, grant reviewers aren't going to understand what they're funding, and they really want to know what that funding is going towards. And a detailed budget is also useful in an instance where you might be receiving a partial award. Many of our regions chose to give partial awards in their efforts to give funding to as many organizations as possible. And if we have a detailed budget, we have a better opportunity to make that partial award match your budget items, to help make your life easier when you're looking at what components were funded. Successful applications summarized the evidence component. We saw many people, again, just not reading our directions. So please read the directions of the application. If you uploaded a 60-page document instead of the 2-page summary that was requested, that may have influenced your funding determination. And this last one is very important. Successful applications did not supplant existing funding. One Ohio funding is for new, enhanced, or expanded services, and it is not intended to be a continuation of funding for services that you already have in place. We were really looking to grow and provide new capacity, so we were looking at those items in your budget. If it was just a continuation of what you did last year, that wasn't the intention for this funding cycle. So that concludes my overview of our 2024 grant cycle. And I know a lot of you are probably wondering, well, what comes next? So I don't have specific dates to share with you today, but I want to make sure you're all aware that our staff and our board are working to establish what our next round of funding will look like. We learned a lot from the 2024 cycle. We are doing analysis of all the applications that we received so we can really understand what is the need in Ohio and design our next funding cycle to really address that need. So if you want to receive the most up-to-date news about our next cycle, I would encourage you to go to our website. If you're not already signed up for our announcements, please do that. And as soon as we have information on the next funding cycle, it will be available on our website. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Angie Lee from the Ohio Department of Health. Angie, it's all yours.
Good morning, everyone. And I was looking down at the number of people who are on, and wow, this is amazing to have almost 500 people online. And so I do want to send a huge shout out and a thank you to One Ohio Recovery Foundation for inviting me to be a part of this. This is a great day to really talk about the grants and resources that are out there to really, how can we give you guys all the tools that you need to be able to make your grant successful? So you can go to the next slide. Okay, you can go on one more. So like Laura said, my name is Angie Lee. I am the chief for the Office of Grants and Resource Development at the Ohio Department of Health. I had asked them to put this quote in there, grant writing is not about writing well, it is about answering the call. And, that's what all of you are here today for, is really about answering the call. You guys are the movers and shakers. You're at the front lines. You are the boots on the ground. And so really on behalf of the Department of Health, we just want to say thank you for everything that you are doing to make sure that, all the Ohioans, have the tools that they need to be successful and to have happy and healthy lives. Okay. So part of today, with this presentation, some of you may say, well, I know some of this, and some of you may be seeing it for the first time. And some of you who, like me, have been writing grants for over 20 years, you may say, well, I know a lot of this. So I'm really hoping that today's presentation, where I will be taking from the very beginning of a grant process to the very end of the grant process, and far beyond that, actually, if you really want to know the truth, and that you'll be able to pick up those tips and those tools, and your toolbox that you have for writing application becomes completely full and actually it overflows with information. So with that, one of the things that I want to make sure that people understand is, obviously the title is Understanding the Basic, is making sure that you're registering at the state and federal level. Register as a nonprofit with the state, and you also have to do that with the federal government. You need to request through the federal government what they call a Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI, and a SAMS number. A lot of times when you have to apply for grant funding, you're going to have that information. Now, one thing that I want to make sure that people understand is when you register with the state, however you register with the state is how you will need to register when you go onto the federal government side. If they don't match, you'll get kicked out of the system. And sometimes it can take weeks and months. And trust me, I know I've been down that road. I actually moved a nonprofit and it took us 2 months to show that we were actually who we were. Some of you may or may not know, we'll talk a little bit about this a little farther in the presentation, but there were a lot of changes as of October 1st, 2024 for SAMS. Like I said, we're going to talk about that, and that's in relation to the Uniform Grant Guidance. That is actually the federal regulations when it comes to federal funding. And I have the links in here, and I saw earlier, I think in one of the chat or the questions and answers, that these these slides will be made available. And so you can actually go into Ohio and Ohio ID, which is where you also have to register if you're going to get any type of funding from any of the state agencies. Another thing to make sure that people understand, when it comes to the federal site requirements, a lot of times you have to go in and register with the feds through grants.gov, but many of the federal funding agencies also have additional steps. And so I've listed some of these here. So for ERA Commons is a lot of times going to be your Health and Human Services, Just Grants. you have HRSA, even FEMA has a separate section. And so what you'll see when it comes to those applications is you may have two different due dates, because one, you have to make sure and you upload stuff into their systems first before you can even submit your application. And I always like to put this information up to make people aware, because again, just like when you're registering with, grants.gov, getting your UBI, registering with the state, it's not something that it may happen within minutes. Sometimes it can take days. And the last thing you want to, you don't want to be in a position where you are at the 11th hour and you just can't apply for the grant because these things weren't done. So go ahead to the next one. So pre-written white papers or boilerplates. This is a great tool to use. I've used it for, I don't know how many years, since I got certified as a grant writer and trainer years ago. I always encourage organizations, again, whether you are a government entity, whether you are a nonprofit entity, a for-profit, is to make sure that you have a strategic plan, whether it be a 3-year strategic plan or a 5-year strategic plan. And the reason why I say that, if you really think about what's in a strategic plan, you talk about what your needs are, what your outcomes and measures are going to be, why is this important to your organization? What's going to be kind of the budget that you're going to need. And when you really step back and think about it, when you think about all the components that go into a strategic plan, guess what? It seems to look a lot like your request for proposals that you get from different entities that are out there. And so I always encourage people to say, okay, let's take that strategic plan now. And I say, write a white paper around it. Go ahead and start to begin to say, this is what we need. Kind of fill in the narrative, fill in what that organizational capacity is. What are you going to put in there, and why are you trying to meet this particular goal within your strategic plan? And the reason why it saves time and promotes efficiency is because when grant applications come out, whether it's from One Ohio, whether it's from other state agencies, the federal government, other foundations, now all you have to do is go into that toolbox and pull that white paper out. You don't have to spend weeks and weeks and weeks kind of putting something together, because you've already done it. You've already done the work ahead of time. So, if you find out about a grant application and it's due in a week, well, guess what? You're set, because you've already got a lot of the work already done. So, that's something I always encourage people to do. I do it. I have a folder that has all the different white papers and all the different things I've ever written. And when a grant application comes up, I'm ready to rock and roll. Next slide. So taking stock, in-kind match, a lot of times with applications or requests for proposals are out there, they do ask for matches. And at the federal level, this has been changed to cost sharing. A lot of the state agencies and foundations still use the term in-kind match. And, sometimes with the things that we do as, not only government entities, but also the nonprofits, there's so much work that you do that maybe you haven't stepped back and said, wow, this actually has a lot of value added. Actually, we can put some dollar amounts to that. So, one of the things I always encourage people, if you are an organization that has volunteers, what? Take credit for that. That's amazing that you have volunteers that are stepping up and helping your organization and really pushing forth the vision and mission. And this is, so make sure that you're tracking those. They have a cost or value added or value associated with that. And currently right now, and these are 2024 numbers, and this is based upon IRS information, that volunteer cost is $31.18. So when it comes time and you have to put forth, that cost sharing aspect of things, you can say, what? We have all this money that we can use as our in-kind, when I say money, I say, intangible dollars, that you can utilize that as part of that cost sharing. If you're an organization that serves meals, and this is the average between, breakfast, lunch. I know some people do backpack programs and other types of programs, but you can actually, again, use that as part of that match. And so, again, look into what you do and take credit for it and put that forth. And that gives you another tool in that toolbox so that that, you don't have to be afraid of that cost sharing or that match. Okay. So asking the right questions, this is really, part of the very beginning of a process. When we talk about, our capacity as an organization, do we have room to grow? One of the things, and I know it's in other places within here, but going after grants or going after funding to fill a hole, to fill a gap, um, is not the best way to approach going after funding. I understand, trust me, I've worked on this public side, I've worked in the private side, I've worked in the nonprofit world. And you want to keep the lights on, you want to make sure that you're still serving the people that you're serving. But it can actually, it'll hurt you in the long run if all you're doing is running around and chasing the money, to fill all these different gaps that, what are the services that are actually going on? Where is that attention going to? And I'll give you an example with the Room to Grow. I worked with, and this was a number of years ago, an organization, and they were phenomenal. I mean, they were a fantastic community-based organization. They had the passion to help people, and this was within the criminal justice realm, but they were a very small organization. And they didn't understand what a reimbursement grant was. And so they had been awarded a grant from the state. And it was a rather large grant. It was close to $1 million. They didn't have that level of capital on them. And so at the end of the day, because they didn't have the staff, they didn't have the dollars, they weren't able to execute what they had originally planned to. And so that's why, they didn't have that room to grow. They didn't know what their room to grow was, when it came to their capacity. They probably shouldn't have taken on a grant as large as that, maybe kind of learn, how this stuff works. And so, they had to turn around and actually give the dollars back. So, that's why I always say, what is your capacity and do you have room to grow? When we talk about who our partners are being, I think I actually saw that somewhere in one of the questions before I started talking about who you can partner with. I always encourage people, look at who's in your community, who's doing what, and really begin having those conversations now. And the reason why I say that, when, grant opportunities begin to come out, maybe there's a grant opportunity and you say to yourself, yeah, we can meet three of the four items in this grant. But wait a minute, we've been working with and talking to this other organization. So we can actually reach out to them right now instead of trying to scurry around and try and find those partners that are out there. And quite honestly, with your strategic plan, who's doing what, you have that room to grow and so forth. So again, I always encourage you to begin having those discussions now. You'd be amazed just how you can support one another. And it actually also fits into your sustainability planning. And we'll talk about that a little bit down the way. Another thing that we always ask, and this is for anybody who receives any type of federal funding, whether it's pass-through funding, whether it's direct funding, it can be grant, it can be cooperative agreement, it can be contract, to making sure that your policies are in compliance with the uniform grant guidance through the Office of Management and Budget. And again, if that is federal dollars. Understanding the funding type, can we do it? Is it an upfront disbursement? Is it percentage based, where you get a small percentage maybe upfront for the planning and implementation phase? Or is it a complete reimbursement grant? A reimbursement grant basically says that you're going to have to pay out, to the staff, to your contractors, or whatever, the bills and so forth. And then you submit those receipts and so forth to whoever the funder is, and you get reimbursement back from that. They're probably trying to solve, again, the cash flow should never be the answer. You always want to ask yourself, does this funding fit into our organization's mission and core principles? I know Laura had spoken before about, they had some very key areas, and some people maybe didn't meet all those key areas. So again, does it fit into who you are? Never change who you are just because you want to get the money. Stay true to who you are, because you're doing the great work. You have those boots on the ground, and you will be rewarded. There are things out there that, you can find to support what you're doing. Another thing is, what happens to the people that we are serving when the money goes away? This is, if a grant ends and you don't have that sustainability in place, this can do a lot of harm, not just because the services might end abruptly, but also, when those people who actually need those services, if they get that sour taste in their mouth, like we were doing great, and all of a sudden the rug was pulled out from underneath us, and now we have nothing. Next time when programs come out or opportunities come out, they may be a little skittish in coming forward. They may say, you know what, we tried this before and they left us high and dry. So you always want to keep in your mind, what is going to happen if that money goes away? Do you have a plan in place? Is there something where you can transfer maybe some of the services over to those community partners and those relationships that you've already developed? Do we have diversified funding portfolio? With COVID, what we saw across the board, a lot of people did not have that diversified funding portfolio. And what I mean by that is, you shouldn't have more than 51%, and that's usually the standard of your funding coming from one entity. What we saw with COVID when everything happened and things were shut down and a lot of the money got redirected to other places or other things. People that were depending on that money, all of a sudden were having to shut their doors or cut their services in half because they didn't have, and they were relying on a primary funder. Maybe 80-90% of their funding came from one place. Always encourage you to really step back, take a look at where's your funding coming from. Look at foundations, look at county government, state government, federal government, in-kind donations, and so forth, and really make sure that all your eggs are in that one basket. And do we need an external audit? I will tell you, external audits, especially from the nonprofit world, can be very expensive. $10,000, $15,000, sometimes $20,000, depending upon the size. Something to think about, something maybe to budget for. Sometimes your foundations ask for an external audit, the state could ask for it, and the federal government could ask for it, depending upon the level of the award. So again, it's just something to think about. And like I said, knowing how much those generally cost actually helps you begin planning as you go forward and really say, okay, now we really want to explore, all these different grants that are out there. Next. Okay, where do I start? For a lot of people, that is a question. I always encourage people to learn about grant season, set up an annual calendar based on a funder's calendar year for each fiscal year. When it comes for the, on the federal side of things, we are starting to ramp up right now. Usually January is the start of it, and it usually tailors off when it comes to the federal funding that gets put out there. So, June is usually when it starts to, you kind of see that bell curve start to come down. The state agencies, they're going to have their calendars based upon, the federal funding they get, or maybe their general revenue funds they get. Foundations, again, they always say, it could be semi-annual, annual, and so forth, to make sure you sign up for those listservs so so you can begin planning. We know these grants are going to come out. Now, I will say a disclaimer, if it's federal funding, and it's federal funding that might even go to states, we've seen obviously in the last 10-15 years different sequestration, so that can always delay funding on that side of it. So you always want to keep that in the back of your mind as well. But the nice thing is too, is if a specific grant is coming out that meets one of your strategic plan goals, again, hey, we know this grant is coming out in 3 months. We can begin planning now. We don't have to wait until it actually gets released. Let's start having those conversations. Prioritize the grants based on your goals. Create draft budgets. Always have that in the back of your mind. We know it's going to cost this amount of money to be able to implement it. Don't commingle, don't supplant. Really have an idea of, yes, this is the budget amount that we are going to need to be successful with this. And again, understand your current expenditure line items. Keeping in mind, this year it costs us this much. We don't know what it's maybe going to look like, but always build in that safety net that it may go up by 3% for the next year when it comes to those costs. So it's not something you don't want, you're going to be surprised, that's going to catch you off guard, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Okay, so found the perfect one, the request for proposal, and sometimes these are called requests for proposals. Sometimes they're called notice of funding opportunities. There's a number of different names. I always say RFP because I say I'm old school and I've been around for like 25 plus years. And that's just kind of what's ingrained in my head. But I do also, they can also refer for notice of funding opportunities and so forth. I always tell people, read, and then read again. And dissect the request for proposal. What I typically do when I am going through an RFP is I go through it the first time, I highlight it. I have little stickies on the side. I have all that. And then I go back and reread it again. Make sure that you're reading it from the very first page all the way to the back page. And the reason why I say that is I was involved with a grant where it was kind of more of an advisor for it. I wasn't the primary author of it, but they did not read the last section. The last section of this particular RFP said you had to sign up with a particular email. If you made it through the first phase, you would get notice that, hey, you made it through the first phase. Now you're going to be doing a presentation. Because they never bothered to read those back pages, they never got that email. So when they inquired as to why didn't we, get this grant and so forth, they said, well, we had you on the list to do your presentation to kind of a panel of individuals, and you didn't show up. That's why you didn't get the money. So I always encourage people, again, read it from cover to cover, from front to end. Know what's in there, know what you need to have, know what costs are allowable and what costs are unallowable. Break down each section in the document. But after I'm done, I have everything titled, and I literally then type what's in that RFP over. So then when I go to write it, I'm literally crossing stuff off. You want to make sure you understand the formatting requirements, and not just the formatting requirements, but the browsers that are needed. However the platforms that people are using, I've actually been in a situation that I couldn't get something to load, I couldn't get something to pop up, and come to find out I didn't have the right browser. So that's, again, a part of why you want to read that RFP from cover to cover. Understand that maybe there's a certain limitation on maybe a PDF, maybe on a Word document, maybe it's something where you have to scan something in. Just understand all that, because you don't want to be at that 11th hour saying, I can't get this to load. And so now we're going to miss the deadline. Have data to support the project. What is out there? There's so much research out there in so many of these different areas. Excuse me. Make sure that you have the data and use up-to-date data. I have been a federal reviewer. I've been a state reviewer. I've reviewed for foundations, and when I see data that is 10 years old, when I know there's data out there that is more relevant, I kind of sit back and say, as a reviewer, is this somebody that, really knows what's going on? Or are they just trying to go after the money and they're just throwing something out there, hoping that it sticks to the wall? So make sure that you have the relevant, it's up to date. And if you don't have the data, because sometimes there are times where there may not be data, you're like, yeah, this is we're exploring a new idea. We really can't find anything. It's okay to say that and say, we're utilizing this as a way to kind of look at, we think there's a problem and this is what we're going to be doing to see if it truly exists. So we're actually going to be producing data to see, that we can begin to use as a baseline and a foundation going forward. Participate in any technical assistance opportunities that are out there. I know One Ohio Recovery, provides a lot of information on their website and different things, utilize that, attend that information, develop a relationship with the funder if appropriate, especially, it really depends on what that grant application is. I will tell you on the federal side, I'll just give you another little story. I have a lot of stories, sorry. I've just been around for a very long time, and a lot of things where I've made mistakes, that it'll be on, mistakes that happen is because I've made them, not because I pulled them from somewhere else. But we had, it was when I was working with a different state agency, and really had a great relationship with our grant manager, always invited them out for site visits, hey, come do a fiscal review, come do, kind of an audit or an oversight. So we were, like I said, we just had that great relationship. So there came a time where there was some residual funding, and I will never forget, he called up and said, hey, Angie, I have $5 million. That's going to be residual funding that's going to be given back. Is there something that you can do with that $5 million to be able to expand or enhance what you're currently doing? And of course, I said, well, absolutely, there's stuff that we can do. And so it was because of that relationship, because we knew who we are, because we had invited him and we encouraged him to come out, that he was able to say, you know what, let me talk to them first. And so again, that helped with that relationship development. Think like a reviewer. If you've never reviewed grants before, there's a lot of foundations out there. You can sign up with federal agencies to understand that review process. You saw earlier the 6 different steps that when Ohio Recovery went through. That's a lot of times, that's how the process works in many different areas as well. That's not something um, that was like, oh, wow, we've never seen this before. Once you, if you can be a part of that, it really allows you to see, what goes through all the, the scoring, what they're looking for. When it comes to the consensus meetings, and if that is something that occurs, it really gives you a different insight in how you go about writing your grants. If there's a rubric out there or a scoring matrix, a lot of times they're a part of it, ask for it, look for it. I always go back if it's something where they're posting these grants online. I go back and look at what previous grant winners did in terms of what their components look like, what their scores were. And so that's something else I do just to kind of say, okay, let me get that mindset in. Go ahead. Winning grants. And we just talked about the rubric, which is why we're going into this. Nothing matters but the scoring. You want to answer each and every question. The other thing too that I say to people is, I don't care if a question has been answered. A question has been asked 3 times in 3 different sections. Answer the question. Follow the directions. And you might say this is redundant. That's fine. It's redundant. This is not about writing, a grant is not about writing a Pulitzer winning prize novel. It is about following the directions. It is about answering the questions and putting forth the information that is needed. Don't waste time on things that don't matter. If a letter of support, for example, isn't needed, you don't have to provide one. Again, as a reviewer, I've gotten grant applications and, someone may have 10 pages of the actual narrative, but 20 letters of support. It's not required of the grant. I didn't look at them because that's not what I'm scoring on. I'm scoring on what was required as a part of that solicitation. So again, answer every single question and follow the directions to a T. Next slide. Multi-part questions danger. Again, still staying on the questions side of things. A lot of times you will see it. There will be maybe 3 or 4 different things that are in one particular question or something that you have to have. I always break those questions down, as you can see on this on this slide, based upon that sentence above with the original question. Who will serve as a project coordinator? Describe their related duties, the amount of time, which agency will house the project coordinator, and then provide a job description. What I have seen before is people get so focused on, okay, who will serve as the project coordinator or their project related duties. And 3 pages later, they're still not, they're still answering that question. And then they may mention the second part, the other aspects of it, but they miss it. Or it's so minute that it can be missed by a reviewer. So always remember, if you have those multi-part questions, because you have to answer and should be answering every single part of the question, break it out. And that's part of that dissection when you see those RFPs or NOFOs. Go on. The team concept. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. My mouth was getting a little dry. This is something if you can do. And I know for some smaller organizations, you may not have all these individuals at your organization, but there's a solution to that, I promise. But if you have the ability, have that coordinator, have that reviewer, have your fiscal person at the table, have your subject matter expert and your evaluator as you begin writing that grant or writing those white papers that might already be in place because you've addressed it with your strategic plan. But have those, and so that way, you can assign different roles and responsibilities as you go through the process, but it also gives different eyes on it. So the team concept, again, is kind of a standard protocol when it comes to grant writing. It's a national standard that is put out there. If you can, fantastic. But the other thing too is, when you think about that subject matter expert or that evaluator, the great thing about the state of Ohio is that we have universities and colleges throughout this entire state. And so what I have done in the past, maybe if I didn't have that evaluator necessarily at a smaller nonprofit that I worked at, I reached out to my university and said, hey, do you have any graduate students or PhD students that are working on capstones, that may be working on their thesis and so forth. That way I could bring them in as a part of that, and it can be that, different perspective and view. Didn't cost me anything. And I was able to put that team together. Go ahead. Again, like this quote, the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. Love that quote by Walt Disney, which is what we're doing today. We're doing. So, yay. You can go on to the next slide. Okay, grant development key categories. And like I said, when we think about strategic plans, a lot of times these are the same categories that you're going to see in the various RFPs or NOFOs that come out. The first one is, what is the need? What is the need that you're intending to fill? And again, as I've talked about before, it's not chasing the money. It's not about organizational funding. You really do want to discuss that current situations. What are the causes of the contributing factors? And what will happen if something is not addressed? Data. I know I've talked a lot about that. And what's interesting is, research-based evidence. Make it measurable. Use personal stories that attach to that. How do we translate the data that we have, and how do we, take that and say tie it to, the social, the social aspect of it. How are we investing in human social capital? Use logic and emotion in this description. And always remember, the lack of service your organization wants to provide is not the problem. Instead, describe the reason for providing the services. That's what's important. Again, it's that investment. The narrative, provide detailed information on how you are best to affect change for your target population. Think like a reviewer. And like I said, you're going to see this a couple times. Answer all the questions, even if you have to answer it twice. Don't use language that overemphasizes how you are the gold standard. Stick to the facts. Speak the truth. The other thing with the narrative, I've been as a reviewer, I've seen things where when people use really big words big words that I've never heard of before, and I'm like, okay, I shouldn't have to go look up what these words are, because they're just talking about how great they are and why they're the best for this program. And usually what that says to me as a reviewer is that this is a lot of fluff, and I haven't seen any type of the true details of what they are trying to do. So it's almost like a distraction or a shiny object that's out there. You don't have to use big words. You don't have to, talk about how fantastic you are as an organization. What you're doing is you're saying, as an organization, we have the tools, the staff, and the relationships to have an impact in our community. And this is what we're addressing. Measures, develop goals, outcomes. Goals are intangible, objectives are tangible. And some may be preset. Now, I will say with this one, if it's something that is going to be, if you see with that particular RFP, if you see that there might be a sister application, or they may be doing an evaluation piece, don't just stick with the ones that are preset. Really look at what do you, or what are questions that you want to have answered, or see things that are that you want to see measured. And so you can always add your own as well. So don't just stick with the preset ones. Be creative, add your own. Have a baseline for that data. If one does not exist, state it and state why. One thing you're seeing now, both on the federal side as well as foundation, I've seen this in a lot of the foundation applications that are out there. Before, we always talked about using SMART goals. They have changed it to SMARTY goals. And they haven't added the inclusive and equitable piece. So that's what the I and the E are there. State who will be affected, behavior that'll change, the amount of degree of change, and that time period. Saying something like, well, we're going to, provide information to 100 people. Okay, I applaud you for that. But what does that mean? What is the information you're applying? Supplying to them? What change is going to be there? What happens after you provide that information? You want to make sure that those measurables, that you can be able to say, of the 100 people, 10% of those are actually going to reach out and sign up for those services. So you want to make sure you have, that degree of change is in there. And you want to make sure that you have a plan for the data collection and the evaluation. That's, again, the SMARTY. If you haven't seen this, I'm not going to necessarily sit here and read through everything, but I do want to put that all up, that there is a link in there if you want the additional breakdown of what the SMARTY goals are, what the definitions are. But, it brings traditional excluded populations into the process. It shares the power, you know, has those benchmarks of marginalized populations. So when we talk about marginalized populations, it could be, when we're looking at Ohio, it could be rural parts of Ohio who maybe don't have access to certain types of transportation, or maybe, the land, they have landlines. There's so many different things. So we want to make sure that we are addressing the, utilizing the SMART goals to make sure that we are being inclusive and making sure people have that accessibility. Again, this is just the outcome objectives for measurements. I always like to put this up, and usually when I do this training, I'm actually in a room and I make people do an exercise, which I know we don't have time to do that today, but I did want to give some examples. So here, example of 600 farmers in Cuyahoga County, and this is no ding on Cuyahoga County. This was just an example that we put up. 500 report regular use of toxic chemicals in crop management. And so you really want to ask the question, is that an outcome? Teach 300 and, so this is the next one, an outcome. Teach 350 farmers methods of pest control that do not require toxic chemicals. And you need to step back and say to yourself, okay, I've taught 350 farmers. But again, what does that mean? Really what you want to be able to look for is, of the 350 farmers that we taught on methods of pest control that do not require toxic chemical, 75% of them stopped using them. Or, I know that's a high number, it's very extremely high, but I was just using that as an example. So it's not just about teaching, it's what are the follow-ups? What's the change of behavior that we want to have an impact on? And you always want to remember this, that's on the page. Outcomes are how we change behaviors because of a process or a method. Ask what will change the problem. That's the outcome. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Simply using the words increase or decrease does not necessarily create an outcome. So I gave another example is, of the 200 students who participate in mentoring, 125 will not have any disciplinary problems by the end of the academic year. Is this measurable? Yes. Is this something that will have an impact? Yes. And actually the impact in something like this, it could be a financial impact, it can be a family impact, it can be a community impact. So there's all kinds of different impacts when you have these types of numbers and you're that specific. Next. Continuing with the grant development key categories is the evaluation. And I know I've kind of talked a lot about this, how will you collect your data and what system will you use? And I know we talked about how some of the grantors will actually have a full evaluation from all, they'll be able to conduct a full evaluation. It really depends on who the specific funder is. Make your proposal by stating that in addition to the funder's grant evaluation, you will also have one conducted. Again, going back to what I said earlier, there's so many different colleges and universities in Ohio, reach out to them. When I was a director of a nonprofit in this state, I actually reached out to OSU, and I might have not should said all that, but 2 different universities in this state. And I wanted to know, in terms of, one of the things I wanted to know in terms of evaluation was the training that was being provided to my staff. Was it impactful? Did it make a difference? And the other one was, were the programs that we were providing, did they have the impact? Which ones, could we maybe get rid of? Which ones, do we need to ramp up a little bit? And then which ones were, doing fantastic? So had 2 different students that were in there. One was in a PhD and one was in the graduate program. And they actually came out and did the evaluations for me for their thesis and for their capstone. And it didn't cost me anything, but I got the information I needed. And so, I didn't have that data before, I had it now. So just, again, think creatively, what are the resources within your own community? The budget and the budget narrative. Match the budget with the outcome. The budget is a plan. Always make sure to read what is allowable cost versus unallowable cost. I know Laura mentioned that earlier, when she had the list of unallowable costs, that maybe some people had that in their budget. And maybe that's something that, hurt them when it came to the scoring of their particular application. And it can vary from funder to funder. So you always want to make sure what those costs are. The other thing is, and this is part of the trick, one of the tricks of the trade, is the narrative is your justification for the dollars you are asking for. You always want to know your true cost. Never inflate the numbers. This includes any type of cost sharing matches and so forth. But the other nice thing about the budget and the budget narrative, a lot of times when it comes to the narrative component, of what an application is. Um, you have you can only have 10 pages, 20 pages, there's formatting and everything. But a lot of times with the budget narratives, there's not a page limit. So what I try and do is I still connect. So when I'm writing that budget narrative, it's not just about, well, we want travel reimbursement, at whatever the rate is. I'll just say 55 cents a mile. I don't just say, oh, and we're going to travel this many miles. No, what I continue to do is, yes, we're going to travel this many miles because we're going to be reaching this many families, providing these services. So I continue to support and reiterate what we are doing as an organization. And now I can put it plain as day is, and this is how it's connected to the money I'm spending and why it's so important. The other thing is, do not supplant funds or commingle funds. You're not allowed to do that. And there is a link within the PowerPoint presentation that can actually take you and give you more information, because that tends to be a question for examples and so forth that I get a lot when I go out and do these various training. What does commingling mean? What does supplanting mean? But you'll be able to click on that link and have additional information for that. Sustainability. As a reviewer, when I look at the sustainability piece, many times with applications that are submitted, it's probably the area that people spend the least amount of time on. Yet is one of the most important parts, because we know, money does not grow on trees. It may not be around, every single year, but what are you going to do to continue operating? What are you going to continue to do to provide these services once the funds are gone? So you really do want to create an organizational resource plan. What's your annual fund? What are your donations? Doing special events? What are other plausible funding streams? And how will this program, if successful, be folded into your daily program? So again, it's not about chasing the money. It's not about filling those financial gaps. This is who you are. This is your mission. This is what you do. This is, you have a calling. And so you want to make sure, as part of that sustainability piece, what does that mean? What is that going to look like? Again, you need to formulate a realistic, specific plan, and details are important. Sometimes I see in sustainability plans, well, we're just going to go after additional grant funding. Okay, but what happens if you don't get it? Then what? So you want to make sure that you do have that very realistic plan. And I talked about earlier where you have those community partners and reaching out to them. Sometimes there may be a component that, if you have those partnerships, we're not going to have this money, but we have this partnership developed. So let's begin having those conversations of how do we transfer, or maybe it's something where, they can provide some of those services. And always with the sustainability is that your, key opportunity is to illustrate that you are a solid organization, both operationally and financially. Sustainability, of course, it does allow long-term effects to be identified. And the thing is, when we think about a program, especially when there's an evaluation component to it, and we're working in the fields of human behavior, you're not going to see necessarily all the different changes of the impacts in a month, 3 months. It could take a year, it could take up to 3 years to truly see what that impact looks like. And so again, that's why it's so important to have that sustainability piece. So in 3 years, or 5 years, or whatever it may be, that you can say, yes, what, we made a difference. Not only did we make a difference, but we're continuing to do what we're doing. And because of that, because we made that difference, that's why this can be sustained. That's why it's important to keep going forward. This require consideration of potential loss of time. Discontinuation, I talked about this earlier, may cause that disillusionment in participants in the community. And so, you may think, well, we know, and again, I'm just going to throw a number out there. We know there's 500 people in this community that have behavioral health diagnosis. Well, we can't find them. We do awareness, we ask for volunteers, we let them know about these services, but only 25 came to the table. Why is that? Is it because they've been burned so many times and they may not trust government, they may not trust organizations because they've been down that road? So that's something that too is very, very important when we're talking about sustainability. Let's not create obstacles for ourselves in terms of that. And sustainability should always be seen as a process, and not just an outcome or something that you have to check off when you're putting something in your grant application. This is something just to kind of keep in the back of your head. By Build America, Buy America Act. This was legislation that applies to all infrastructure projects that are funded by the federal government. You know, that when it comes to purchasing equipment and so forth, if you have money from a specific federal agency that is bound by this, because some have had waivers, so you don't have to, that a certain percentage, and it's 55% of the components of maybe equipment that you're buying have to be produced or manufactured in the United States. And I always just like to make people aware of this, because sometimes they are not. They don't know that this actually existed. Next. So tips of the trade. Submit your grant early. Excuse me. Even though I say 48 hours in the slide, I typically allow myself 72 hours. And so when I put together, when I've dissected my request for proposal, when I've put together my timeline, and when I want things completed, I usually give myself that 72 hours that I'm going to submit it on this day. And the reason why is, one, there's always things that happen along the process. And sometimes it's just the technical issues that may come up. And so that gives you that time. So, you know, if something's due at 5 p.m. on a certain date, or, you know, a certain date, that it's not 4:59 and you couldn't get it resolved, but it gives you plenty of time and a buffer for that. You know, do not step outside your wheelhouse just to get the money. Always make sure that your documents are ready to upload. This is another one. Do not use jargon or acronyms, or use plain language principles. You don't know who's reviewing your grant. I know Laura had put up all the different people who, you know, looked at the various grant applications. You know, that one of those individuals who was looking at it, and maybe the first time they've heard about you before. And if you're using jargon or acronym, and you're using words that, you know, maybe they're not familiar with, that actually, you know, can kind of hurt what you're doing and what you put forth. And, you know, as you put that pen to paper, you know, one acronym may mean to me, it's going to mean something very different to someone else. When it comes to the federal applications, it's not like if you're from Ohio that somebody in Ohio is going to be reading your application. It could be somebody in Hawaii, it could be somebody in Alaska, it could be somebody in Texas. So again, you want to use that plain language, and you want to avoid that jargon and those acronyms. Again, don't assume the reviewer knows who you are or why you're asking for the funding. We've talked about the sustainability. We've talked about answering every question. Make sure you review your expenses. You know, going after non-monetary words, this is something that I always encourage both government and nonprofits to do. There is a lot of items that are out there that are considered in-kind donations. So if you're an organization, for example, that provides clothing, maybe you provide hygiene, you know, if you're working with individuals who are homeless and you provide the hygiene packets, or maybe it's the backpacks for food. There's so much information that's out there that you can get those in-kind donations to your organization. And I always say that because if you were spending, let's say, again, throwing a number out, $500 a month on purchasing these items, what could you do with that $500? Where could you redirect that money if you got everything that you were buying as a donation? So never overlook the non-monetary words and the technical assistance. You know, a lot of times there's organizations both on the foundation side as well as the federal side that you're not going to get a monetary award, but they'll be able to provide you technical assistance. And I will tell you, I've utilized this before. It was actually through Department of Health and Human Services. Again, smaller nonprofit was coming into this organization to kind of build up its capacity, and the board membership and the bylaws for the board wasn't quite cohesive. And so there was an opportunity, applied for it and got it. I got 6 months of technical assistance and support and consulting from another organization out of New York who was assigned to us to help revise and build up the board of directors for the organization. You know, and that if I had gone and paid a consultant to do that, that could have been thousands of dollars that I had invested. But by doing this, it was something that did not cost me anything. And I got that level of expertise and commitment for doing it that way. Break up text boxes, break up text, use text boxes. A lot of times people don't realize that you can underline in red. If there's something that you really want to get across, or you want to make sure that the reviewer isn't missing, underline it in red. A lot of times I will use footnote items to save spaces. And it was interesting, about a year and a half ago, I was attending a grant seminar, and it was through the CDC. And what they found was, when you have that breaking up text and using text boxes, um, it actually improved your score, and getting a higher score by 80%. And this was something the CDC had spoken about, because if you think about it as a reviewer, if you're on your sixth application that you're reviewing, let's be honest, we're human. You start to get, your eyes start to glaze over, and you may miss stuff and so forth. But what it does is it brings the reviewer's attention back to that application by doing that. And I will tell you, I do this. I use this as a practice. I constantly underline in red, especially if there's very specific things within the application that have a higher point value. I do not want those reviewers to miss it. I want to make sure they see it and it's right there. And so, in that it stands out. Once you, again, I know I've talked about this, but once you select a grant to apply for, try to find a list of previous partners, check their 990s, but also go back and see who've gotten the awards before. And this may not be available on every site or every, funding organization, but I want to kind of see, like, what were they looking at? What were they really looking for when they, were making these, when they were giving these dollars to these organizations? I do that all the time. Just make it a part of the practice on what you do when you're going after certain funding, when we're going after funding. Other items to have ready, make sure that you have your 501 determination. If you have annual reports, sometimes those are requested. Any type of brochures that you can throw into a PDF file. Other funders that you work with, a lot of times you will be asked that question, both on the federal side, from foundations, from corporations. Who else provides you money? Because again, they want to make sure that you are financially stable. Make sure that you have in past evaluations, performance metrics, that organizational history. And sometimes they will ask for that, list of board members and who they are and what their roles and responsibilities are as it relates to your organization. So, just have a little folder in your computer that you can pull these documents off, and just make sure that you update them regularly. Common mistakes. I think I've harped on this a lot, so I'm not going to talk about this anymore. The other thing is not having 90 days of cash on hand. Again, saw that during COVID, where, and I'm not getting into, that, but we saw so many organizations that did not have that cash on hand. And I know there was a lot of money pushed out, but there was things you had to apply for. And it doesn't matter, what happened or did not happen. They just didn't have the ability to keep their doors open because they couldn't pay their staff and they couldn't pay their contractors. And so you always want to make sure that you have at least 90 days cash on hand. Because again, sometimes money takes longer to reach you as well. I worked with a friend last year, and the majority of her funding was reimbursement funding. And she had been with an organization that had been around for 20 years. And so, it's been around, it's done that. But what happened was, the grants that they were getting were reimbursable. And then one of their grants got cut, and then they weren't going to get the notice of some other grants that they applied for. So they ended up having to shut their doors because they just did not have that cash on hand to be able to operate. So again, that's another piece that, when you look at your budget, when you look at your strategic plan, what does this truly mean for our organization? And do we have this? Not keeping up with the regulatory requirements, lack of organizational policies and procedures. I've seen people get in trouble for this. And then not looking beyond the brick wall. So I put that in there because, and I will say, growing up, my father always said to me, Angie, how long are you going to beat your head against the brick wall before you realize that you can go around it, look over it, and maybe even dig under it? And so I always put that in there because it's not just looking about what's the here and now in front of me. What is our organization going to look like, in 2 years and 3 years? Being creative and, not just kind of like, what do we need to do? What's that growth that we've talked about? Notice for award contacts, many times with your federal and even some with your state and foundation. Don't just put your name on it. Make sure that there's different contacts. That way all the information gets to who it needs to go to. And so then you don't miss anything. overview. So there's a lot of changes that are coming with the uniform grant guidance that actually went into effect on October 1st of this year. And what those are, this is for um, federal funding, but it does not matter if you get the money directly or if you have received it from maybe a state agency, a county agency, maybe another partner agency that got it directly from the feds. This was done originally. The Uniform Grant Guidance was put out in 2015. This has been the first truly major overhaul of all the regulations. And so what I encourage you, and please feel free to email me and I can send you all the documentation and links that you need. But it talks about procurement, indirect costs. So for example, I'll give you some examples. The indirect costs went from 10% to 15%, which is huge for nonprofit organizations, even for government entities, to be quite frank. And so that was a huge thing. The equipment going from 5,000 to 10,000. Really, two things that happened with these particular changes. One, they really encourage now, if you're applying for a grant, for participant inclusion. And what I mean for that, as you're developing that, or as you're developing your application and your program, that it's not just me sitting behind a desk putting words on paper. It's really reaching out to the people that I'm going to serve. I want to hear from them. What is going to make a difference for them? Maybe it's an incentive base. Maybe it's something like, what are the barriers from getting to appointments or maybe getting to the treatment that you need? It could be transportation. It could be something of daycare, all those different things. And so what the new Uniform Grant Guidance says is you can actually write into your budget as direct cost, if someone needs daycare, for participant costs, it could be travel reimbursement, it could be stipends, it could be all those different things. So now they're really letting you, when it comes to the federal funding, to be able to write those costs in. The other thing that was never usually allowed every now and then, depending on who the funder was, allowing you to pay for and use within your budget the cost of evaluation. So that is actually going to be another allowable cost that has changed. And like I said, it is a huge document that they put out. But I just wanted to give you that little bit of information so that way you make sure that your policies are in place, because there are going to be policies that are new that are going to be required. For example, whistleblower policy. That is something that is new in the Uniform Grant Guidance that any organization, whether you get federal dollars, you have to have in place and make sure that all your employees have it. So just want to put that on your radar. If you want to go next. Also, recent regulatory changes, the U.S. Supreme Court with the Chevron ruling. Agencies no longer have the broad authority to interpret regulations. Jurisdictions will now have to reach back out to the federal government to seek that clarification. Davis-Bacon final rule, wage requirements for construction projects. The focus now is on compliance with prevailing wages. And some of you may say, well, this has nothing to do with me. This isn't something we do, and that's fine. I just always like to make sure that everyone who's out there who applies for funding just has this information to put in their toolbox. Research and funding, research site examples. I love the United States Census Bureau, especially the American Community Survey, which actually in February of last year, they launched very specific data sets. That's live data sets. So it's real-time information and real-time data. And again, I can provide to Laura, I have preset links for all of Ohio stuff. So that way people don't necessarily have to look for it, but I can send that to Laura and use that as a resource to put that out there. So I love having that. And like I said, you can kind of set up those reports and everything. The ALICE report that's actually done by the United Way, that actually breaks it down on the United Way of Ohio. It'll break it down into so many different aspects of so many of what everybody does, especially when we're talking about behavioral health, when we're talking about recovery. They really break all that information down by county, and that's usually done on an annual basis. Ohio Auditor's Office has a lot of information when it comes to needing very specific information about demographic, socioeconomic. I always like to reach out and look at, I'll say reach out, I actually go to the website and see what they have on there and see what the county information. The Annie E. Casey Foundation always has a lot of information. The state and federal agencies, the Council for State Government, a lot of times your state associations also have stuff that's out there that you could utilize. This is something new. That's the federal program inventory. This actually started in the end, well, probably this past summer or summer 2024. So what the federal government has done is they have created this database that shows you every single program that's out there in terms of the federal government. And so maybe you're looking for specific funding or maybe you're looking for a type of funding, but you're like, I never see this under, I'm just going to use EPA. I never see it, but maybe you can put your program or what you're looking for, and then it'll show you all the different funding streams that are out there because of the federal program inventory. And then this is something even again for data for Ohio. This is a website that's in there. Funding site examples, grants.ohio.gov is the Ohio Grants Partnership. GrantStation, and let's say GrantStation, I do not get any kickback. We always have this disclaimer. When it comes to nonprofits, this is for nonprofits only, but this is something that's out there and it'll give you every type of funding every type of funding and in kinds and so forth. It actually has training and tips and different type of stuff that you can also utilize, but it is for nonprofits only. Typically the subscription, I believe, is about $169 a year. But if you have, if you're involved with TechSoup, that usually can drop it down even so forth. Grants.gov is obviously the federal website. A lot of times your agency listservs will also have information about funding, local foundations and businesses. And then I use the Philanthropy News Digest as well, and that's supported by Candid. And they actually send out every single day all the different RFPs that have come out that are foundation based. So not necessarily the government side of things, but all the grants that come out that are foundation based, and they do list that by topic. Next. Again, these are just some references that are in there. And that's kind of it. And like I said, this usually takes me about 2 hours to do, but because we're virtual, it's a little harder. Usually I'm up walking around and we have a lot more discussion, but I really hope at the end of the day, and I'm always available for questions, that you've been able to walk away and say, wow, I learned some new stuff or stuff I didn't think about, or that you've been at least able to put one new tool in your toolkit when it comes to applying for for grant funding. Sorry about that. When it comes to applying for funding. And like I said, I'm always available for any type of technical assistance beyond this webinar.
Thank you, Angie. That was so informative. Really appreciate your time and sharing all of that information with us. We now have a little bit of time at the end here to answer your questions. If Sarah, are you going to be?
Yes. Hi, y'all. If we could actually go back one slide, maybe two. Yep. Go back one more, please. There was a question about the federal program inventory link. Angie, do you have that link that you're able to share with us?
Yeah, if you can I can't click on it. Can you click on it and it'll show you?
It might mess up all of our screen sharing potentially. Oh, there it goes.
Did it work? Okay, good.
Okay. Hang on, let me type it in.
Let's see. fpi.omb.gov.
All right, thank you. And then Angie, another question for you around the new uniform guidance. Is there a place that you suggest folks go to learn more about that?
So actually, what I would do is, hold on one second. I'm gonna reach down. Sorry about that. I kind of disappeared on everybody, and I know that. I'm gonna give you that website. So this is a very long one, but if you want to go to the Office of Management and Budget, it's through the Federal Registry, and it's under the 200 CFR, but it's here. Let me see if I can type. Can I put something in the question and answers? Am I allowed to? Will it let me?
Let's try it. Yeah, I think you can answer them.
Okay, let me do.
I'm not sure if everyone will be able to see.
Oh, okay. So
I'm not sure.
So what I'm going to do is, I don't think I can either. I'll type answer. Well, it's not going to help me. So this is really long, but I'm going to give it to you. It's HTTP:// the 2 backsplashes, federalregister.gov / documents 2024 / guidance for federal financial assistance.
Thank you, Angie. And we will be posting the recording and the slides of this on our website. So we'll try to include a link to the uniform guidance and some of the stuff in the PDF that we post so y'all can click directly into them.
People want, I actually have done kind of a Cliff Notes version of the uniform guidance. And what I did, so my years on the policy side of the state, I actually took an example from LSC. And what I did was I said, okay, here's the language that's been cut out. Here's the language that's been added. So some, how LSC does it, or when you introduce new bills in the state of Ohio, how you have some stuff underlined and some stuff crossed out. That's how I did the Cliff Notes. So I have all the different definitions, all the different requirements and everything. So that's something else that I'm more than willing to share. It's actually gone through our communications area and so forth. So that document's ready to go. And then another thing, and Laura, I don't know if you wanted to show that. If people are looking for funding, my office, myself and my staff, we put out every Friday, and it goes through our different local health departments as well as our different community partners. But we actually put together a weekly grant spreadsheet, and it probably has every type of grant that's out there. We actually pull the federal grants, the state grants, the county grants, foundation, in-kind, technical assistance, and everything else that's out there into one document. And then we categorize it, those different tabs. So if you're looking for something for behavioral health, maybe you're looking something for housing, we put out every single grant that is currently available. And more than welcome. And I know Laura can share, or someone can share, I'm not sure, my email address. And all you have to do, it's very simple. Just shoot me an email and I'm more than happy to put you on this listserv. I don't know, Laura, were you able to?
I didn't have it ready to pull that up.
I put you under the gun. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine. And I think we could send a follow-up email perhaps to our participants today that includes that information.
All right.
And
go
go ahead, Sarah. I'll say we have our info email here, info@oneohiofoundation.com. If you have a really specific question, please feel free to email us if we're not able to address it in today's webinar.
Yes, Angie, I think you'll be getting lots of emails after this from looking at the Q&A. And also, Angie, you got a lot of kudos. So fabulous job. We all learned a lot. And our friends at the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services are on the line. And we want to make sure we flag that they post new funding opportunities on their website as well. So if you go to supporting providers and then click apply for funding, you can see funding that they have available. So thank you, OMAS, for sharing your funding opportunities. Scrolling through, looking for some other questions. This is a good one related to in-kind donation amounts. I think this one's for you, Angie. Where do you get those? How do you estimate those? Folks would really love to be able to cite their in-kind donation amounts on future grants.
So, one thing, like I said, on that grant spreadsheet, we actually have a list of the different in-kind donations that are available, and many times they will provide the estimated value. So, and again, I'm going to say this because this is one I used when I was an executive director for a nonprofit. And again, I'm not trying to say that they're better than somebody else. It was just an example that I'm going to use. Is a lot of times I would use Good 360, which is for nonprofits only. So sometimes you would have to pay for some of the donations, but some of it was in kind as well. But they always attached a value to it. And when they gave you the receipt, depending on what you got, that was always included as part of the documentation. And same thing, I've used Bath and Body Works when it came to the hygiene projects. That was something that we did because I ran a nonprofit that was addiction and mental health recovery drop-in center. And so a lot of times we provided that information. And so, for example, Bath and Body Works would provide us, here's how much you're getting, and this is what the value is that's attached to it. Same thing when it comes to the different food donations. A lot of times those organizations will provide you with that information.
Thank you, Angie. That was really helpful. And I know a lot of folks are commenting that the Federal Register link didn't work. Don't worry, folks. We will send a follow-up email as well as update our website with that link. So if it's not working, we will be getting you the correct one here soon.
I did see that someone said indirect, it actually went from 10% to 15%, not 5 to 10%, which is huge.
Okay, the indirect. Okay, perfect. Oh, and this was more, I wanted to share just in case folks couldn't see it. I know earlier there had been a question related to EMS, fire departments obtaining AED equipment. And someone shared that they just received 3 units from their local Department of Developmental Disabilities. So they suggested reaching out to local, state, and federal agencies to see if they have any extra. So love seeing folks sharing resources and other funding opportunities and product donation opportunities with the group. So thank you, Sonia, for sharing that with us.
If you're not registered with the Department of Administrative Services, who is in charge of the various surplus entities, both on the state and federal level, I strongly encourage you to register with them. And again, I can provide whatever information is needed to Laura and team. But I'm different hat on. When I was with a different nonprofit, when some of the state agencies were actually closing or shuttering some of the residential facilities they had, I went to DAS and I said, hey, I'd like to be a part of this, when it goes going through the building. And so we were actually able to go through some of those residential facilities that they had and put our name tag on stuff. And then all we had to do was supply the truck to go and pick up everything. So, you can also go on their website and I say shop, but they will list all the different items that DAS has available. And as a nonprofit, the only cost associated to you would be the transportation or the pickup and so forth. So I, again, strongly encourage you to register with the Department of Administrative Services for those surplus entities, those surplus items.
Okay. Another question we have, they are a rebuilding organization, really focusing a lot on their strategic plan as opposed to doing a lot of activity at the present moment. So how might that impact having a successful grant application? Kind of feeling like chicken or the egg, we're focusing on kind of rebuilding strategic planning, but we don't have those direct services yet. How would you kind of advise them to apply for funding to get programming when their programming hasn't started yet?
A couple different things. One, I would look at, if I were in their shoes, what I would look like as I was doing my strategic plan, where do we want to be in 6 months or a year to now? And then really looking at those grant opportunities and really putting forth that calendar with those different services. Because one thing you always want to keep in mind too is, if you apply for a lot of times with a government grant, you could apply for April and you may not get the notice of award or, any of that information until September 30th. If it's the federal government, some go a little bit beyond. Or, if the state puts out funding and maybe it's general revenue funds and the budget, has to be done by a certain time and maybe it takes several months to do that. So that's why it's the importance of that great calendar when you're looking for those program services, is really looking at what is coming out, when it's coming out, so you can build that into that strategic piece of it. And a lot of times too, if you don't have a strategic plan, if you have the infrastructure, I always say, at least start small. If it's something that you are in that rebuilding phase, don't go after, a $5 million grant. Maybe go after one that's a capacity building grant, or that technical assistance is another thing I would encourage people to do.
If I'm new to writing grants, what guidance would you give me, or where, are there any trainings or conferences that I could go to learn more if I'm just getting started?
So I will tell you, grants.gov has a lot of different trainings. A lot of state agencies here in Ohio actually put on grant training seminars. There's actually going to be a grant training, it's a national event at the federal, it's a national one. And give me 5 seconds and I'll give you the exact name of it. Do you have that real quick? The brochure for that grant training. It's going to be in March. It's March 12th to the March 14th, but it is a huge one. It's the one that's the biggest one in the country for our grant training. Also, GrantStation has a lot of stuff. If you want to look at Candid, they have a lot of opportunities within their website, and so does Amplifund. So those are all kinds of different resources that you can look at if you're just going down the road of writing grants. There's just a lot of tools out there. And again, feel free to email me. I've seen a lot of people asking for my email. And so it's angela.lee@odh.ohio.gov. And feel free, and again, I can provide you all this information. It's not a problem. This is part of my job, is that resource development. And it's not resource development for me, it's helping our community partners and everybody that is out there doing the work. And so the conference that's coming up, it is the National Grants Management Association. And it's for their annual conference. It is in Washington, DC. It is in person. So that could be, something that some people may be able to do, may not be able to do. But it is on March 12th to March 14th. And I'm actually going to this one. Because even if you've been doing this for 20, 25 years, I learn new stuff all the time. And I'm always looking for, additional tools that I can put in my toolbox.
Fantastic. Angie, can you say your email one more time, and I'm going to type it into the Q&A.
I talk really fast, so sometimes people just have to put their hand up and say breathe, and that's okay. It's angela.lee@odh.ohio.gov.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Looking at the clock is probably going to do it for us. A lot of great questions, a lot of great ideas and feedback going. And as always, there is our email account should you want to email One Ohio. Laura?
All right. Thank you for joining today. The recording of this will be available on our website. Just give us a little bit of time to get that updated. We really appreciate everyone taking the time today. And Angie, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you. I was more than happy to. And thank you for asking me.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.